This module introduces you to the idea of how to format our survey. What determines the format of your survey? First and foremost is the research question. Second, feasibility. In the first case, the overall design of your project and of the survey itself is critical to determining its format. What kind of sample will you need to be relevant to your research question? What mode of distribution is necessary for your research question? Second, feasibility. To whom will you have access? Will you have access to the population you need to sample? What's the cost? That may have a huge impact on your format. As in the case of our class survey, because of our limited budget, we have to do a convenient sample distributed via social media. What's your timeline? We only have 10 weeks, and we can't extend the timeline. And lastly, do you have a required response rate? Do you need a certain proportion or percentage of people to complete your survey? Some methods have higher response rates than others. You may want to consider the idea of a mixed mode survey versus a mixed methods project. A mixed mode survey is when you've distributed the survey via more than one method. For example, you have both in-person interviews and online responses. This is highly discouraged. It is not a good idea. People's responses may depend on the format in which they are asked, and the answers are not comparable. A mixed methods project combines different methodologies in one research project. You might have a survey, a quantitative method, combined with in-depth interviews, a qualitative method. This is encouraged as it allows you to have different types of questions answered within one research design. There are several different modes of survey distribution. Surveys may be self-administered, and under this might fall web-based, mailed, or in-person but written surveys. Under this might fall a captive audience, such as when a class is surveyed, versus a voluntary participant situation, such as when you might volunteer for a SONA project. There are also telephone surveys in which an individual interviews you, and in-person interviews. Self-administered surveys are completed by individuals unaided. One big advantage to this is respondents tend to feel very anonymous and are more willing to be honest with their answers. Respondents also have time to reflect on their answers. They can take a break if they need to. A downside is that response rates tend to be very low for self-administered surveys. If people don't have time to do them right away, they usually don't go back and complete them later. Lastly, there's a tremendous amount of response bias with self-administered surveys. Those who complete the survey are probably qualitatively different than those who choose not to. Hence, some serious concerns for self-administered questionnaires are, is there response bias? Another thing to consider is who actually filled out the survey. In theory, to whom you sent it may not be who actually completed it. Did the individual understand the survey? They couldn't ask you any questions. They may have misunderstood the intent of a question. It's not very good for open-ended questions. If you have a question that requires a longer response, people tend to not want to fill that in on self-administered questions. That works better for in-depth interviews. Computer-assisted surveys, such as we'll complete for this class, are self-administered through a computer or web-based platform. Things to consider with computer-based surveys is that generally, for you, the researcher, the coding and data entry is facilitated. This is a big advantage. It's great to not have to input that data yourself, which can be very time-consuming and costly. On the other hand, you've now limited your survey to people who use computers or use them frequently. I know that may seem like everyone on a college campus, but that's not true of the general population. Response rates tend to be very low, sometimes under 10% for computer-based surveys. If that's the case, well, we have a problem. They're probably very different than the general population. And that means there's a tremendous amount of response bias with web-based surveys. As you'll see with our class project, I'm betting we'll discover that our friends and family don't look that much like the general population in some ways. Mailed surveys are Pen and paper surveys delivered by mail. Mailed surveys can have higher response rates, 60 to 80% if you're a tenacious researcher. A survey that's a mailed survey usually needs to have at least a 60% response rate, meaning that at least 60% of people to whom the survey was sent need to send it back, for it not to be a disaster, for response bias not to be such a concern. There are things a researcher can do to maximize their response rates in mailed surveys. First, make sure the questionnaire is attractive and has plenty of open space. Using skip patterns can decrease people's patience with your survey and cause them to stop taking it. Don't have too many open-ended questions. People aren't going to want to write a lot. Make sure your cover letter is professional and personalized. Altruistic appeals tend to produce higher response rates than those that imply that the person completing the survey will receive some kind of benefit. People aren't likely to believe that, but they are willing to help you out, especially if you thank them. Having a credible research sponsor will also increase your response rates. Fortunately for us, universities tend to be considered credible research sponsors. And make sure to include a self-addressed stamped envelope. Nobody's going to hunt down an envelope or stamps to send back your survey. In order to get a good response rate, you want to do what's called tenacious survey collection. That is, after your initial mailing, and actually this is good for web-based surveys too, about 2 weeks after, you want to send a reminder. Hey, did you see our survey? Would you be willing to still consider filling it out? Wait another 2 weeks, and then send a replacement questionnaire. Usually we recommend waiting another 8 weeks and sending a final replacement questionnaire, if possible by certified mail. Usually with repeated contact, we're able to get a response rate of close to that 70%. Keep in mind, it's imperative that you protect participants. There are several cases in which you might need to keep track of which individuals are completing your survey. For example, in the case of the mailed survey, you might need to know who's returned the survey and who hasn't. If you're using a sampling frame and you want to recontact individuals who have not completed the survey, you'll have to keep track of who did complete the survey. You might also be doing a longitudinal survey, a survey in which you survey the same individuals across time. Some longitudinal surveys survey different individuals, so then it wouldn't matter. But if you're trying to survey the same individuals across time, you need to keep track of which survey came from which individual. In this case, you would assign a code number to each individual completing your survey, and you'd put that code number on each survey. You'd then have a master list stored in a secure location, ideally in a locked drawer in your office on your college campus or in a locked and secure facility on your university campus. It should not be on an open server to which others have access. Once you've completed the research, it's imperative that you destroy that master list. A variation on a survey that's sometimes used in social science research is what's called a diary. With diary research, participants keep a diary or a log of something across a specified length of time. This obviously then is used to measure behaviors across time. You're asked to fill in this information on an ongoing basis because it's easy to forget things when you don't keep track of them right away. Just as a simple example, I was asked to participate in a study for Caltrans. They asked me for a 24-hour period to keep track of everywhere I went by any mode of transit, whether it was my feet or my vehicle, a bicycle, whatever it was. This was pretty easy for me to do since it was while I was on maternity leave. Telephone surveys are interviews conducted by phone. Frequently, random digit dialing is used as a methodology to capture people in a certain area. It's common for measuring things like public sentiment, things like election polls, new policy changes. On the other hand, we also see scam artists calling with fake surveys trying to get personal information. Some things to consider for telephone surveys. With the random digit dialing, that used to be a great way to semi-randomize your survey. for a particular area. However, now you might have a cell phone that has the prefix for a particular area and not live there, while someone who does live in that area might have a prefix for a different area, and you might not have a home phone. Another issue is with caller ID. Many people don't answer the phone anymore for survey researchers. This population may be different than the population that will answer the phone, thereby creating even more response bias. Telephone surveys work well for things where you have a very short time frame and you want to reach a lot of people. They also do tend to make people feel fairly anonymous, and it allows for some open-ended questions that might not work on a web-based survey where people might not have the patience to type in answers. On the other hand, you have to consider the quality of the interviewer. This varies widely. On many occasions, I've been correcting the pronunciation of the person interviewing me about some sort of local issue in Los Angeles. Interviews. In some cases, you may complete a survey by being interviewed by an individual. On the other hand, in-depth qualitative interviews are a little bit more in-depth. Interviews could be close-ended, where you're asked the exact same questions as everyone else in the exact same order, often with specific close-ended answer categories. It could be a mixed survey in which you're asked a series of closed and open-ended questions, or it could be primarily open-ended, in which you're asked questions to which you'll give a verbal response of your choice. Surveys are usually primarily close-ended with maybe a few short, mixed, open-ended questions for people to answer. With interviews, it's always important to consider how the presence of the interviewer will affect the responses coming from the participant. People tend to be most honest and comfortable with those who are like them. This can be a disadvantage if you have a very diverse population. Some people may feel inhibited because of the researcher's presence. Other people may be attracted to the researcher because of something about them. Either way, you're creating response bias. One big advantage, however, of having the person there is they can explain things if the participant doesn't understand something about a question. And you can have a few more open-ended questions. No matter what kind of survey you're doing, they all follow the same basic format. A cover letter, some kind of introduction, usually combined with an IRB statement or an institutional research board statement of some kind, a clear action of consent by the participant, check here to continue, sign here, turn the page to indicate consent, or a verbal statement of consent, clear, unambiguous instructions for what the individual should do next, and then the survey questions. Your cover letter should make your study appear credible. Be sure to use official letterhead and clearly identify you, your affiliation, and your sponsor. If done through a computer platform, you still want to do all of this except, of course, the letterhead. Provide any necessary contact information so that respondents can contact you and/or your sponsor as stipulated by the Institutional Research Board requirements. Reaffirm either the anonymity and/or confidentiality of any information provided. Please think carefully about whether your study is truly anonymous. If it isn't, then you can only protect confidentiality. You cannot provide anonymity. For our project, I set up SurveyMonkey so that we won't know the IP address of our participants. This means that we can guarantee them anonymity as well as confidentiality. Be sure to thank the participants for their assistance. An altruistic appeal will raise your response rates and make the study sound interesting, important, and relevant. Having a survey that's attractive and easy to understand will increase response rates. Directions should be clear and unambiguous. If someone can make a mistake, they're going to. You want to make your surveys as error-proof as possible. That is one nice thing about web-based surveys. They make it harder for people responding to make a mistake. Don't bunch your questions together too much. That increases mistakes. How you structure your survey questions shapes and limits what you can do with the analysis. For example, You can reduce the number of data points in your answer categories, but you cannot expand out from less to more. So if you aren't sure what form you might want a variable like GPA in, you might want to ask for it as a number. You can always recode it into categories. You can't go from those categories back out to a number. Some questions are dichotomous closed-ended questions, meaning you only have two possible answer choices, yes or no, present or absent, something like that. Sometimes you'll see people include a middle ground category. It's still a similar type of question and used in similar types of analysis. You can put together a series of yes-no questions to create an index or to create a more complicated picture. For example, if you were trying to measure something like student involvement, you might have a series of yes-no questions about a variety of things in which a student might be involved. Later in the class, I'll show you how you could construct those into an index of student involvement. You might also have questions that are ordinal rating scale response questions. Anything that's strongly agree to strongly disagree, strongly support to strongly oppose, or as in the example here, measuring something that happens over time. Similarly, you might be asked to rank something yourself, what you think is most to least important on a list of items. While these are great questions and a great way to measure things, they're a little bit difficult to analyze using the statistics we're going to cover in this class. So while they're great questions, I wouldn't use them for this particular project. Finally, we might have questions where we ask individuals to fill in the blanks. For numeric questions, these will be very comparable. For example, we might ask them to type in their GPA rounded to 2 decimal places, or we might ask them to fill in their age in years. It's time to start thinking about how you want to operationalize the variables in which you're interested for our project. What are some good sources of inspiration for good survey questions? The literature. How have other people asked it these questions? I'd also check out past surveys posted online on the Blackboard site. Even if it's a slightly different topic, you might get some ideas for how to write a good question or some creative ideas. And finally, there's other surveys publicly available online. There's several different databases at our library that include data sets. Often in those data sets, you can take a look at the questions used to generate those data sets. Frequently, that's where I get inspiration for new survey questions, and then, of course, I cite the sources.